Blessed John Henry Cardinal Newman is a convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism. You know that he will be canonized next month. And in one of his sojourns, he was coming from England to Italy. There was a blinding storm, like a typhoon, no? And so he alighted from the ship that took him to Italy in an island, and it was dark because the storm was blinding, the wind was furious, and the first thing he saw was an old Italian woman. And this old Italian woman was lighting a candle in the chapel in front of the statue of Blessed Virgin Mary. And you know, that experience really left a deep impact in his heart, and that was instrumental in his conversion to becoming a Catholic. I tell this story because of two reasons. One, it's really an illustration of our faith, a faith in action. You know, sometimes faith is here in the head, it's very notional. And in fact, Cardinal Newman was the first one who wrote about that faith that is experiential is a greater faith than faith that is notional. So whenever we see all our voyadores, every one of us who yells or shouts, "Viva la Virgen! Viva el Divino Rostro!" It's a faith in action. It's a faith that is experiential. And you see, if you go to Naga City, which they're doing this today or yesterday, the procession, sometimes you cannot even penetrate the crowd. The experience is just electrifying. You agree, right? That is the faith in action that is alive, that is vibrant, and that faith is very important to hold on to and to pass to the next generation. The other point I want to bring out in that little story is the story of the inner desire, the desire of the heart, which is the gospel today. The desires of the heart. A sword will pierce the heart of Ina, so that the inner thoughts or the desires of the heart might be revealed. We start with the first reading. The first reading is very important. This is Genesis. And you know what God, the Lord God, the first words that were uttered by God after Adam and Eve have sinned. What are the first words that God uttered? Where are you? Where are you? It's a very important question for us, my dear brothers and sisters, to meditate and reflect upon. Of course, that question for Adam and Eve, because God was walking in the garden, was geographical. He was looking for them. Where are you? But that question is very existential for each one of us. It's not just geographical. Where are you? Where are you in your spiritual life? Where are you in your growth and development? Where are you in relation to each other? Very existential question, not geographical. And so I think that is a very important question to us to answer, because it has to do with the inner desire of the heart. What is your inner desire? Do you want to be holy? Or do you want to just be extravagant and go around the world being merry, eating, drinking, just like one of the stories in the gospel? Eat, drink, and be merry. What about my relationship with God and my fellow human beings? In this question, where are you? Adam said to the Lord, I am afraid. That's why I hid, because I am naked. You know, those three things are very important to look at. I am afraid, I am naked, and therefore I'm hiding. You know what is hiding? We hide sometimes because we are ashamed. There is malice because we have sinned already. And so, this is very important for us because we are all sinners, right? So I am afraid, I'm naked, and I hid. Naked, there is shame, there is guilt. And so, when we look at ourselves, the inner depths of our hearts, then this has a lot of influence in terms of our desires. Do we want to hide forever? Or do we want to be redeemed of our guilt when we have committed sinfulness? That is the human condition that we all find ourselves in. Very existential. And that is the faith that we have. That's why we go to Mary, so that Mary can bring us to Jesus. The gospel, of course, again, is about the desires of the heart, the inner desires. You know that a lot of us come from humble beginnings. You know, like in Nabwa, there's a lot of my townmates who have come to the U.S. through the U.S. Navy. I myself came through the U.S. Navy. Father Michael was a U.S. Navy man, a chaplain in the U.S. Navy. So there's a lot of connection with the U.S. Navy. The president, my second cousin, was a commander in the U.S. Navy when he retired. So we can relate to all this. There's also a lot of Filipinos coming from our native country who have become nurses, doctors, dentists. And this is not to exclude those who were not successful in their careers. But the very fact that we are here celebrating Ina is a sign of the inner desire that has become successful. Not so much in terms of money, but in terms of how we have become in our human growth and aspirations. So, speaking of the U.S. Navy, I remember I was on a ship, the USS New Orleans. And during Westpac deployment, when we go to the West Pacific, Asian countries, including Australia, I remember going to the back of the ship, the fantail we call. And there was a friend of mine who would go to church almost every day, and I would go to church also almost every day because there was a chaplain on our ship. And we go to the fantail at the end of the Mass and we will look at the stars. Milky Way sometimes. Stars. And there was a deep longing, I remember, a yearning for something whenever I look at the stars. According to John Paul II, desire also is very much connected to the stars. The stars are called sedera. And the root word for that comes from also desire. Desiderium. Sedera. And you know, the Blessed Virgin Mary sometimes is called the star of the sea. And so, when we have this desire for something that is great, that we yearn for, that we long for, the Virgin Mary is part of that desire. In the Gospel of Luke, which we read from today, the Gospel of Luke, if you study the Gospel of Luke, the theme of the Gospel of Luke is what we call the Great Reversal. What is the Great Reversal? The Great Reversal has to do, because it's all over Luke when he speaks about the lowly has become exalted. The last has become first, and the first has become last. And this is what this gospel is all about, my dear brothers and sisters. You know, the poor has the greatest desire. Or the poor is a person of desire. What do I mean by that? You know, when we are poor, we are always longing for something. That's why in our native dialect, oh, he's so decidido. He or she is so decidido. The word decidido comes from desire, desiderium, desiderium. The poor is a person of desire. And when we are poor, and I'm not just talking about financially, But when we are poor in spirit, we have this inner desire, the greatest aspiration of the human heart, which is to be united with God. Isn't it? The greatest aspiration of the human heart is to love and be loved, which is about God. Because we cannot really love fully if we don't have God in us. Our loves will always be imperfect. But when we are united with God, if we are growing in Jesus, if we are going in Jesus through Mary, then our love becomes perfect. And this is the example of Mary. Last night we did our penitential procession. And the gospel today, Simeon is prophesying about the 7 sorrows of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And these 7 sorrows, you all know, from the moment that Simeon prophesied, to the flight to Egypt, to when Jesus was lost for 3 days, and when Jesus met his mother on the way to Calvary, the crucifixion, the taking down of Jesus from the cross, and ultimately the burial of Jesus. You see, Mary is suffering throughout her life. And what does this mean? This is what love is all about. When we love, especially when we love unconditionally, then that means that we have to suffer for the sake of the other. There is no such thing as unconditional love when we don't suffer. Because love means sacrifice. Love means death, a dying to self. And this is what Jesus has modeled for us. Let me end with a story, not to prolong so much my homily. But the story is about a well. Okay, we used to go to this farm when I was little. You know, I come from a family of a big family, 12 children. And we used to go to this farm in Lourdes Young. Okay, some of you Navanians would recognize this. And this is where my old aunt would live. And there was a well in that farm. And we usually look at it. It was so dark. There were some frogs in it. There were some ferns. But the well was deep and moist. And I heard that my aunt, during the old days, they would draw water from it and boil it for drinking. When I went to college, I visited that farm again. And I saw the well was dry. And I was wondering why it was dry. And I asked some of my relatives who were there, I said, how come the well is dry now? And they said to me that because no one uses it anymore. Because now there's modern plumbing, there's running water, so there's no need to draw water from the well. You wonder, why did the well run dry? Because it's not being used anymore. I did some research, and I found out that this kind of well, they run dry when it's not being used. Why? Because the water from those deep wells come from these hundreds of tiny rivulets, you know, little openings underground. And this is where the water comes in, seeps through. And every time you draw water from the timba, then the water is kind of stirred. And so these apertures, these rivulets are always open when we draw water from it. The moment we stop drawing water from it, then of course the water is so still. And then these apertures, these openings, these rivulets, they tend to close. And if there's no more supply, then of course what is remaining there will evaporate. And so the water, the well, runs dry. This is an example, my dear brothers and sisters, and a kind of a metaphor for the human soul. When we stop drawing water from the springs of salvation, from the living water of God, we dry up. It's a very important metaphor that we can reflect upon. We want to draw water constantly from God, through Mary, through our faith in action. so that we can grow perfectly as the Father commanded to be perfect. When we don't do this, we stop growing. We become stagnant. And so, we have to look at our inner desires. And in order to grow for us, our desire has always to be there, to constantly be united with Christ. When we have this desire in the heart, then we are a well that always supplies water. We are vibrant in our faith. We are energetic. We love. The deepest aspirations, like I said, of the human heart is to love and be loved. And if we are drawing water constantly from the living waters of God, then we have this. We are alive. We are Catholics. We are Christians whose faith is active. We are youthful, as the theme says. We do Christ's mission with youthful hearts with Mary. And that is the inner desire that we should practice.